Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to fit the electronics to the Axial SCX10 III. We're a bit out of order from the manual due to having to wait for some bits to arrive in the post, but we've got them all now, so let's put it together. First up we have a FlySky GT3C modified with the upgraded firmware for up to 8 channels and lots of programmability. There's a video on the channel with a how-to if you're interested. For the shift and dig servos, I've gone with the Spectrum ones, partly because they come with the servo saver bits that they don't give you in the kit, and partly because I want to see if they're any good. In the future, we'll probably look at some alternatives if these ones give up. The receiver is a FlySky 6 channel. I found with the case it wouldn't fit into the receiver box, so I've uncased it. I've also given it a couple of coats of a silicone conformal, so it should be pretty much waterproof. And of course we have a Hobbywing WP1080 for the ESC. There are some other brushed ESCs that are possibly a little bit better, but you can't argue with about 45 quid. Just make sure you get one from a good store and make sure you're not getting a fake. In the UK, if it's come through the UK distributor, you should have Schumacher stickers on the box and on the ESC. Now, a couple of videos ago we loosely put together a receiver box so we didn't lose any of the screws. We just threaded them in eternal seam. We'll need to take them out again now so we can mount it and remove the lid. We'll need to pull out the silicone bung as we won't be able to get all the servo leads through it, especially once we have the lights to deal with too. If we offer up the case for the receiver, you can see there's just no way it's going to go in. Well, it will kind of go in if you run it corner to corner, but then you're not going to be getting any of the servo plugs in. Without the case, the bare PCB does fit a treat. You need to have the servo pins up at the end with the hole though, as there's a bit more height in the lid for the plugs. To fit the receiver, we will use one of the nice 3M sticky pads from the kit. But first, we'll give the surfaces a quick wipe down with some alcohol to remove any oils or grease. Just give it a good wipe around and then give it a minute to evaporate. Now you can cut the pad to size, peel and stick the receiver in. To attach the box to the chassis, we use the 3 screws that we took out, 3 M2.5x8 countersunk. We won't bother putting the lid on just yet, as we've still got all the other bits to connect up, but we can tuck the antenna out of the way. Next we have the servos, so we'll be going back to bag G, section 3 for the diagrams. Here we have the remains of the bits from bag G. We need 2 M2.5x12 countersunk, and 2 M2x6 cap heads, along with the servo arm, springs and the caps. The missing piece of the puzzle are the servo saver bosses, which are included with the Spectrum servos. A right sod they don't include them with the kit, but I think there might be a bit of logic behind the decision, other of course than trying to force people to buy the Spectrum servos. Now I haven't checked, but I'm fairly sure I read somewhere online that the spline count on these servos is a bit of an odd number. So the bosses simply aren't going to fit other servos anyway. But then if Spectrum used the same spline count as most of the other micro servos, we wouldn't have the problem in the first place. Axial do a servo saver kit that comes with a couple of different spline bosses, so it's not like they haven't got the parts available. Oh, I don't know, but it's annoying whatever their motives are. Anyway, to put them together we'll need to center up the servos. Now you can connect them to your radio, making sure the trims are all centered, or better yet, if you have one, just use a servo tester. We connect up some power along with the servo and center up the control. Now we can pop the bosses onto the servo, then the arm, followed by a spring, the cap, and one of the countersunk screws. All the parts fit very nicely, as you'd hope, although I did find the servo saver did grab a bit around centre, so I took it apart again and added a tiny smear of grease on each side. I reckon after some use it probably would have freed up by itself, but the grease certainly won't hurt. The other servo is exactly the same. The only thing to watch out for is you get the arms facing the right direction. You can check the main part of the diagram to check which way they're supposed to go. To fit the servos onto the chassis, they just offer up to their mounts with a bit of a jiggle so they find their way in, making sure the posts on the gearbox are aligned with the servo arms, then screw in the 2 M2 screws for each servo. Nice and simple, and it does look rather tidy. We'll have to see how the servos fare with use, of course, but I'm happy enough with the install. Next up we have the ESC, but before that we need access to the motor, so we need to remove the motor cover. We've got the screw in the front that attaches the pulleys, then the two screws at the top that attaches the engine. Just make sure you keep track of which is the long and short screw for when it goes back together. The ESC A1080 already has the XT60 for the battery, which suits me nicely. So all we'll need to do for soldering is solder the motor wires to the motor. Before we do that though, we need to decide on the position of the ESC. You really need to trial a few positions and orientations before you stick it down. You want to be sure that all the wires reach where they need to go and you have somewhere to hide the excess and the wires won't get caught up where they shouldn't. When you're 100% sure, we can clean up with some alcohol and stick down with a foam pad. Nice. When we solder the wires to the motor, we need to know which way round they want to go. What with the channel reverse and getting the wires backwards, it can be tricky to know that you've got it right. The easiest way to make sure you're correct is to disable the reverse completely on the ESC using the programming card, which means powering up the truck. But we've still got a few bits to do first. I've done a few basic settings on the transmitter already. I've set the thumb button on the grip as a momentary control of channel 4 for the dig. The plan is the dig is only active when the button's held down. Otherwise the truck will be in four-wheel drive as normal. The gear shift is on one of the rockers as a two-position switch for first and second. Before we power up the truck, we need to reduce the endpoints of the steering, gear shift and dig. We want to be sure that whatever the servos do, they can't overshoot and stress into a bind. Turning the endpoints down to 20 or 30% is usually plenty, so you can see some movement without risking the servos. Next, this receiver hasn't been bound, so we'll need to plug a bind plug in and power it up. You can hook up an ESC and use your main battery, but I like to use a receiver pack so I'm sure the truck can't try and drive off on the off chance something goes very wrong. While the LED's flashing, we power up the transmitter with the bind button held down. The LED on the receiver should stop blinking. If so, it's bound. Now we can turn it all off again and remove the bind plug so it's ready to go. Now I think before we do anything else we should tidy up the wiring a bit so it's not getting in the way. For the power switch I'm going to mount it to the radio box so it's accessible up the inside of the chassis. There's just enough space for a finger, but it won't get pressed with a stick when on the trail. As usual, we'll give it a quick wipe with some alcohol and stick it down with some tape. It's easy enough to find, but won't need the body removing to get at. Most of the excess servo leads can get folded up in the radio box before fitting the lid. You need to be super careful though that you don't get any of the leads caught when doing up the screws. And of course, because we haven't used a silicone plug, it's not going to be waterproof. Once all the lights go in and the wiring is final, we might use some silicone sealant. But with the receiver conformally coated, I'm not in a huge rush. Right, motor wires. We need to get a feel for where the wires want to go so they won't get in the way of the engine cover. It looks like with the 550 motor it's going to be a little bit tight, so we'll need to have the wires so they come off the sides of the tabs and tuck down into the chassis. To get to the tabs we're going to need to remove the motor with its mount. There's the cross brace that needs to be removed first. Then we've got the gear cover. After a bit of a wiggle, the motor will pop out and we can position it so we can get at the tabs without melting anything with the soldering iron. It's worth noting the end of a lot of motors have a small plus on one side of the end bell for the positive side where we're going to be soldering the yellow wire. It's not 100% though, but more often than not it gets you spinning the right way. First we're going to tin the tabs with some fresh solder. Then of course we find the wires come up a bit short to be convenient, so we have to lay the motor down, making it a little bit awkward. After adding an extra smear of flux to the tab, we can use a pair of tweezers to grab the wires and hold it in position while we heat up the joint. Make sure the solder has melted and start to flow, then take away the iron. Same goes with the other tab. The biggest thing when soldering motors is to have an iron or gun with lots of power. 100 watts or more makes it really easy. With the motor wire soldered, we can flip the motor round and refit the gear cover to clamp it down. Before we fit the cross member though, we'll test the setup just to make sure the throttle channel reverse is correct and the motor wires are on the right way round. Right, we need to turn the transmitter on, pop a battery on the mount and plug it in, turn on the ESC, and we should find the system powers up and we have some steering. If so, we can turn it all off again and connect up the programming card. It plugs into a 3-pin header on the top of the ESC. This time, when we turn it on, the programming card fires up. We want to change the running mode, item 1, to value 1, forward brake, effectively disabling reverse entirely. Now we can turn it off again and unplug the card. Now when we power up the truck, we can see if it's set up correctly. So if we pull the trigger, nothing happens. That's because the channel is reversed. All we're doing is applying the brakes. Pushing the trigger away makes the trucks drive forward, so we know the motor is wired the right way round, but the throttle channel on the transmitter needs to be reversed. So we turn off the truck, go into the menu on the radio and reverse the channel, turn the truck back on, and we get forwards travel when we pull the trigger. Perfect! We just need to put the ESC back into running mode 3 and it's all going to be good to go. All the forward and reverse anyone could ever want, with a drag brake in the middle. Okay, with that done, we can refit the cross member, the engine cover, and the pulleys. The last thing to set up on the truck are the endpoints of the servos. If we zoom into the shift and dig, you can see how they're supposed to move. We want the endpoints set so they can move the rod ends all the way in and out, but without straining. If they buzz, back them off a bit. It's also a good idea that while testing, add a little bit of drag to the wheels to help the clutches engage. Sometimes, if everything is extremely free running, the teeth on the clutches will sit on top of each other and not engage. I found the 2-speed to be really easy to set up, but the dig was a bit finicky. It can be tricky to tell if it's set up just so. So you might want to drive the chassis around a bit just to test it out. Okay, nearly there. We just need to adjust the battery mount a bit and nip up the screws, plug the battery in, fit the body, and well, that's one SCX10 III ready for the trails. There's going to be a bit of tweaking with the ESC settings, but you really can't do that on the bench. For me, I usually find dialing back the drag brake and punch makes the truck much nicer to drive, but we'll have to wait and see. Well, the build has been a rather good one overall. A couple of nasties like the steering servo mount and the micro servos, but other than that it's been great. All the bits go together very smoothly and there's enough complexity in the gearbox to really get you thinking. The body and the accessories are top end. I think the only major downside might be the price. In the UK at least, there's a bit of a premium for it. I'd like to see it at least 50 quid cheaper, but of course that doesn't make the truck any worse, you just have to save up some more pocket money before you buy one. Up next with this truck will be a couple of running videos. Then I've got some upgrades to fit, so that should be fun. But in the meantime, as always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!